Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started with the webinar in just about 1 minute. We are just taking some time to make sure that everyone is admitted. In the meantime, I want to note that questions should be submitted via the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. After the presentations are over, we should have a few minutes available for questions. Now, at this time, I would like to invite Meryl Stein, a librarian at Falvey who specializes in disciplines including political science and public administration, to give an official welcome and to introduce our featured speakers today. Welcome, Meryl.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final pre-election session of our 2020 U.S. Presidential Election Series event. On behalf of Falvey, we would like to thank our event co-sponsors, the Center for Peace and Justice Education, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Communication, the Department of Public Administration, and Let's Vote Nova. We'd also like to thank all of you for joining us as well. As a reminder, Election Day is quickly approaching on November 3rd. For more information about the election, voting, and additional resources, please visit Let's Vote Nova's webpage and see Falvey's blog, and some links may appear below or in the chat box. Today, we are honored to welcome a panel of faculty experts from across Villanova who will discuss the meaning of the election in a pandemic year. I'm going to introduce all three speakers now so there will be plenty of time for their talks. Dr. Danielle N. Gadson is an assistant professor of public administration at Villanova University. She holds a BS in economics from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, an MPA from Villanova University, and a PhD in medical sociology from Temple University. Today, Dr. Gadson will talk about single-issue politics, fodder in past elections, and the ubiquitous effects of public health policy being a critical consideration this election year for every voting demographic. Dr. Billie Murray is an associate professor, Department of Communication at Villanova. She completed her doctorate in communication studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, earned her BA, summa cum laude, in communication studies and political science from the College of Charleston, and her MA in communication from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Today, Dr. Murray will discuss how the recent movement for Black Lives has influenced the 2020 election and how such movements can also work to transcend electoral politics. Dr. Tim Horner is a faculty member at the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University. He received his Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University, where his doctoral work examined early Jewish-Christian relations. He also has a Master of Divinity from North Park Seminary and a Master's in Jewish Studies from the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Today, Dr. Horner will give us a global perspective for the upcoming election. Now, at this time, I would like to invite our first panelist, Dr. Danielle Godson, to begin. Danielle?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Meryl, and thank you so much for having me at today's panel. I'm very excited to be here with all of you to talk a little bit about the impact of healthcare policy on the election. So I just have a couple of slides that I'm going to share with you this morning to kind of give us some context for what I'd like us to consider. In general, I am a researcher that's interested in healthcare equity, specifically thinking about racial equity and healthcare policy for those in our population that are most vulnerable to healthcare disparities and inequalities. And so I was doing some just general research and wanting to give some context from which to share two basic themes with you as it relates to healthcare. So I pulled up these two charts that we can see here from Pew Research Center, and they conveniently do some polling of folks throughout election years in order to get a sense of what issues are among the top issues for voters. In the chart on the left, we can see 2016 results, and this was back in June of 2016, where the issue of healthcare is fourth here on the list, with 74% of registered voters saying that healthcare is very important to their vote. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the same chart, but given for the 2020 election. And so this was completed in late July through August, first week of August in 2020. And as expected, healthcare is certainly a bit more, is a bit higher in terms of the ranking, even though the percentage of registered voters indicating that healthcare specifically as a single issue we have a smaller percentage, right? 68% of respondents. And so the two issues that I'd like us to think about within this context, right, are these. So first, healthcare, I would argue, has moved from being an important issue, yet very much a singular issue for American voters prior to this pandemic year. And so now we're seeing healthcare as more of a multifaceted approach and a complex issue that touches many other issues in the top 10 voter concerns as we look at these charts. So that's the first piece that I'll talk a little bit about. The second piece that I'd like us to consider, right, is that in the past, healthcare debates were primarily about values, right? So thinking about the societal oughts, what we ought to do, right? What we ought to do about healthcare reform, what we ought to do about individual mandates, right? Individual mandates ought not infringe, right, upon our personal freedoms. So thinking about how we envision, right, our system to work, and that being based in particular societal in individual values, right, that individuals hold dear, right? In this election cycle, I would argue that the healthcare debate is a bit more based on personal experiences and data, right? And so now individuals that may not have had much of an interaction, whether it be positive or negative, right, in terms of thinking about their access to insurance, thinking about their access to treatment, thinking about their likelihood of needing to spend a long period of time out of work and in some sort of medical treatment, right, is starting to shape people's perception of healthcare, right? And of course, you know, facts and data and experience have always been part of the election process, but nor in the past it's been more of a minoritized view, right? Individuals that did have specific concerns as it related to healthcare, similar to issues such as you know, abortion or thinking about the treatment of gay, lesbian, transgender people, right? That people that have a specific connection to those particular issues, of course, are relying on their experiences and data and personal experiences with those issues when they think about how to process their perception of that particular election issue, right? And so now the people with experience around this, right, that my life is different, my life is somehow touched or changed by this particular federal approach, right, to healthcare, right? That's much broader, right? Because all of us are being impacted and all of us are being touched in that particular way, right? And so again, while some will still stick to values and oughts, right, and there's nothing, you know, wrong with that, the average voter, right, is also going to be informed by their personal experience, right, due to the pandemic, right? So those are the two concerns that I'd like to briefly discuss this morning. So if we go back to 2016, again, we see that healthcare is important, but as we scan through each of these categories, right, it's pretty much a standalone issue, right? Again, 74% of voters ranked healthcare as a top issue, right behind economy, terrorism, foreign policy, right? But this ranking is slightly lower, right? In 2016, slightly lower. We have the Affordable Care Act is in place. There are some concerns about the individual mandate, some concerns about whether it's going to be repealed or not, right? But the attention to healthcare is pretty much consistent with prior years, right? As again, Americans are not significantly impacted by the Affordable Care Act, right? But have these kind of episodic and value-based opinions about how the law and how the program ought to be, right? This ought, how it ought to be structured, right? And while for policy, health advocates, and researchers, and those struggling to navigate a disjointed healthcare system, understand how the issues of healthcare flows through all of the issues that we see here, pretty much on the left-hand side, right? The average voter is, again, commenting or thinking of it in terms of a standalone issue, right? But obviously, such is not the case for the 2020 election. Okay, so we have here again healthcare named as the second highest issue, right, behind the economy, right? And we also see that the coronavirus outbreak is its own category, right, in 2020. But as a voter, right, when we think about all of these other categories that we have on the right-hand side, how can we think about, for instance, the issue of the economy, right, without consideration for our personal experiences living in, right, a pandemic-induced recession, right? So the issue of health, right, or health care, right, because of the pandemic primarily, right, is causing an infusion of the consideration of health into many, many other categories, right? How can we consider the importance of the issue of Supreme Court nominees, right, without the intervening concerns for the future of the Affordable Care Act, right, and Roe versus Wade? Again, we can have Supreme Court appointments as its own category, right? But the connections are a lot more salient for voters in 2020 between, right, the interconnections between these categories, specifically thinking about health, right? And then finally, racial concerns for racial and economic inequality, right, are undoubtedly colored by the inequitable effect of the pandemic on Black, Brown, and those that are economically vulnerable, right, during this time of the pandemic, right? Again, many of these connections are not new, right? But the number of people and the awareness, right? The number of people impacted, right? And the awareness of the general population, right? Has much far further reaching implications, right? Far greater implications that shift, right? The foundation of our perception, right? From the abstract, right? What we ought to be to the lived experience of what is actually happening, right, to what is happening. So when we think about, right, if we adjust the category of healthcare itself, right, perhaps that can, most voters are speaking about the future of the Affordable Care Act, right, the protection of people with pre-existing conditions, right, which also has become a heightened issue because of COVID-19, and so many of us, 6 million plus that are, living as survivors and as folks that were able to move through COVID-19 successfully, right? So 55% of adults have a favorable view of the Affordable Care Act, right, out of all voters, right? And nearly 6 out of 10 live with someone that has a pre-existing or chronic condition that would negatively impact them if the Affordable Care Act is overturned, right? 6 out of 10. That's a lot of voters, right? That's a lot of voters that have firsthand experience and perhaps firsthand concerns or fears, right, about what will I do, right, if the Affordable Care Act is overturned, right? As it relates to the Supreme Court nominee, right? Justice Barrett's confirmation last night might be seen as a threat to both the ACA and Roe versus Wade, as I mentioned before, right? And 58% of adults don't want to see the Supreme Court overturn the ACA, and 69% of that same group don't want to see an overturnment of Roe versus Wade, right? So again, these issues are now at the forefront of our minds, right? Because of the process that we've just been through in health, right? Even though the Supreme Court appointment is a separate category from healthcare, right? There are clear connections and implications, right, that come as a result of that, right? And as a final example, right, COVID-19 is clearly related to health, right? Clearly related to health. But again, when we think about the polling of individuals, right? Right now it has its own category, at least according to the Pew Research Center and the polling that they've done this year, right? But the COVID-19 issue that's being discussed is the development and distribution, right, of a vaccine and managing the outbreak, right, of COVID-19, right? The extent to which we have faith, right, in our elected leader, in terms of, can we get a vaccine that is safe, right, and efficient, and how are we going to manage, right, this outbreak, right? And over 2/3 of adults say that they're at least somewhat worried, right? 2/3 of adults are at least somewhat worried, right, that they or their loved ones could become sick from coronavirus, right? It's a huge group of people, right? And as we know, we can't silo, right, our opinions, right? These are ubiquitous issues, right? That, being concerned about being sick, right, or your loved one being sick, your parents, your children, right, your partners, right, is going to also, again, color, right, people's voters' opinions about other issues that are tangentially related to health, right? And it's also interesting to note that a little more than 6 in 10 individuals are concerned that the FDA is going to actually rush to approve a vaccine without making sure that it's safe and effective, right? So something about that uncertainty, right, can certainly be unsettling for people, right? So again, the main point here, right, is thinking about this shift from, healthcare being its own thing, and we have an opinion, right, about healthcare, right, that comes from how we think it ought to be how it ought to be set up, how it ought to be created, how people ought to use it, right? In this lived reality, right, that we have living through the pandemic, right? In terms of what does healthcare mean to me, and being able to see, right, how an issue such as a pandemic touches every single component, right, of our lives. That's not something that's lost on voters, right? But of course, and I won't spend much time here, right? That we certainly have a partisan, difference, right? When it comes to healthcare being a particularly important issue, right? So I'd be remiss in not acknowledging this partisan split on these issues, right? And so, as we can see, issues of the coronavirus, issues of healthcare as a standalone issue, right, are certainly seen as more important amongst Democratic voters, right, as compared to independent and Republican voters. But again, I raise that critique, right, that if you have a Republican voter, right, that's concerned about the economy, right, somewhere in there is going to be the effect of the coronavirus as well, right? The effect of how are we going to get our economies back on track, right? After this pandemic induced recession, right? Within the concern of Supreme Court appointments, right? It's at top of mind, the healthcare related issues, right, that are going to be coming soon or quickly, and I'll talk briefly about this in a moment as well. Well, that will be coming to the attention of the Supreme Court, right? So again, these divisions, and perhaps going forward into the future, right? These divisions are going to become less bright, right? And we'll have a lot more blurring. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is something new, right? Health and healthcare has been infused, right, through many of our societal practices and policies and initiatives over the years, right? But when we think about the average voter, right now, they're able to make that connection, right? And so these numbers here come from Kaiser Family Foundation, right? But in my last 5 minutes or so here, right? I also will be remiss if I didn't take some time to go back to the oughts and the values, and thinking about the perceptions, right, of what ought to be, right, when it comes to the issue of social justice, right, and when it comes to making decisions as a part of our election process that amplifies, right, and considers those in our communities, in our populations, in our nation, right, that are either marginalized, vulnerable, or unable to raise their voices on their own, right? So when considering the issue of healthcare in this election, right, the first thing that I wanted to remind us of, right? Although on a national level and certainly in the Supreme Court, in the courts, we are going back and forth, right, about the issue about individual mandates, and folks have their own opinions around, again, the protection of individual liberties as it relates to the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act, right? But it's also too important to be aware of, right, outside the fact that we often, in the media often talks about, the 20 million people that will likely lose coverage, or be underinsured should the ACA be overturned, right? But the ACA was still in the process of working in some communities, right? The ACA isn't done, right? There's still work that needs to be done, right? And so it's important for us, again, to remember that while the Affordable Care Act has led to significant improvements for many Americans, right, in healthcare access and affordability, there are large gaps that remain, right, as it relates to racial inequity and income-based inequities as well, right? So a repeal or overturn of the Affordable Care Act, right, is not only going to expose a great large group of people, right, to underinsurance and uninsurance, it's also going to undo a lot of the active work that's being done, right, to improve health disparities in many communities. Okay, so it's important, again, for us to understand, right, that there are ongoing income and race-based disparities in healthcare, especially as it relates to healthcare quality, affordability, and the use of emergency departments, right? Those issues don't go away, right? Just because most of America, right, are satisfied with with the Affordable Care Act, right? There's still more work to be done, and by cutting that off at the pass, right, we're kind of restarting the system, right? That's going to take disparities that are still persistent, right, and make them even worse. Okay, so that's a huge danger, right? That should be considered, right? Quickly, thinking about the COVID vaccine, right, in the Black community, right? There are significant concerns in the Black community about a COVID-19 vaccine, and these concerns are rooted, right, in a distrust, a historical distrust, right, for government, right, in a historical distrust, right, for medical and health providers, right, that comes from, right, a lived experience that Black and Brown people have had in the United States. Okay, so the question about, do we think the FDA will come up with a vaccine or not, right? In our trust, right, in that process is going to vary based on who we are here in the United States. And so thinking about the best administration that would be able to help us work through that issue, right? Help create and reinforce that trust, right? So that we don't continue to see disparities, right? Or we don't worsen disparities, right? Because of people being weary of or not wanting to utilize the available vaccine, and also not paying attention to the government, not paying attention to the communities that need it most, right? Is going to be another problem that we need to be concerned with, right? And just briefly, I'll finish in 30 seconds or so here, right? We want to be aware of, in terms of the economy, there's a disproportionate effect of the economy on Black and Brown people, company owners, minority small business owners, right? So again, when we look at that issue of the economy and everybody's concerned about the economy, right? There are groups of people that have a greater impact, that are more greatly impacted by that issue, right? And then lastly, I will share here, after the confirmation of the new justice last night, right? We're already seeing in certain states, as it relates to Roe versus Wade, right? We're already seeing the call, right, for consideration, a reconsideration of certain policies that impact people. Okay, so those are all, issues that, again, they could be considered single voter types of issues that I just shared with you right now. But my main point there is to think about that not all of us have the same experience, right? So even though more people are making the connections between healthcare and other parts of their lives and other policies that they might have opinions on, right? We also have to remember those of us that have minoritized voices in those situations, right? And do what we can as academics and those that are pushing towards social justice to amplify those voices. Thank you for your time. And now we will go on to Billie, hear from Billie Murray. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gadson. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. I'm so honored to be here presenting with these two amazing colleagues. And I want to take just a second to thank Gina Duffy and Callie Stahl and Meryl Stein and all the Falvey staff for their hard work in organizing this panel and the entire election series. I cannot believe we're only 1 week away from this election. So today I've been asked to talk with you about how social movements affect presidential elections. More specifically, I'm going to talk about how the recent movement for Black Lives has influenced the 2020 election and how such movements can work to transcend electoral politics. So to be clear, social movements as a term encompasses a lot of things. There is so much that goes on in social movement organizing that the public doesn't see, and a lot of effects that they have on politics that often goes unheralded. But today I'm going to focus in on just one aspect of social movements, which is protest. And I'm focusing on this not because it is the most important or even the most effective tactic that social movements engage, but because it is the social movement tactic with which I have the most experience and expertise, and also because protest is almost always the most visible tactic used by social movement activists. As every one of us saw in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and far too many other Black Americans, protests in so many different forms permeated our mainstream and social media screens. Depending on how we see ourselves as citizens, as Americans, and as people inhabiting a multitude of social locations, we often have questions and certainly have opinions about protests and different kinds of protest tactics. The most common thing that I hear from people, especially people who've never maybe participated in a protest, is that protests don't matter, especially when it comes to mainstream electoral politics. Protests are often viewed as simply outbursts of anger or violence, that they're designed simply to get media attention and don't really do anything, and that they maybe simply are ineffective in persuading people, especially persuading presidents. And I'll admit that on the surface, it doesn't look like presidents are really persuaded by protests. For example, when asked about anti-war protesters during the Vietnam War, President Nixon said that, quote, "I understand that there has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam. As far as this kind of activity is concerned, we expect it. However, under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it. To allow the government policy to be made in the streets would destroy the democratic process." And I find it particularly troubling that so many US presidents, and because it certainly wasn't just Nixon, and even everyday citizens see protest as anti-democratic, despite the fact that it is the right sort of most enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution. After the tragic murders of student protesters at Kent State by the National Guard in 1970, Nixon spoke out against those protesters again, stating that they were simply, quote, "bums blowing up campuses," and that he was, quote, "hoping rioters had provoked the shooting." We see a similarly troubling position from our current self-proclaimed law and order president. President Trump has spared no harsh words for or direct actions against protesters, whom he dismisses outright because they, quote, "aren't his voters." He has directly threatened protesters with violence, first against protesters involved in removing Confederate statues from public places. He said, quote, "There's going to be retribution because there has to be. These people are vandals, they're agitators, they're terrorists in a sense." It's so difficult to quote him. And His mobilization of federal agents who have tear gassed, shot, and snatched Portland activists from the streets has received widespread attention and critique. And so the recent actions of our sitting president against protesters should concern all of us. But tellingly, what those reactions are indicative of is the importance of protest in presidential politics. And it's revealing of just how much presidents are actually affected by protests, even if they sort of claim not to be. And I should note here that it's not only Republican presidents who have insulted or at the very least dismissed protesters and their tactics. When asked about the Black Lives Matter protesters that have filled our streets for months, former President Jimmy Carter equated those protests with violence, stating that violence, whether spontaneous or consciously incited, is not a solution. Similarly, presidential candidate Joe Biden released a campaign ad in the wake of the same protests, stating that, quote, rioting is not protesting, looting is not protesting, setting fires is not protesting. None of this is protesting. It's lawlessness, plain and simple. Now, of course, you're probably thinking, well, they're talking about riots and violence. They're not talking about protest. But the fact is that throughout our history, the lines between these kinds of tactics are often drawn in the wrong places, especially by politicians. And the effect of that is that more nuanced understandings about why a protester might engage in symbolic violence, such as looting or property destruction, gets completely left out of the conversation. And so to be clear, the violence that these presidents or presidential candidates are sort of condemning, the violence that has occurred during the movement for Black lives has almost entirely been symbolic violence. Things like property destruction or looting, not physical violence against people. The physical violence that has occurred at Black Lives Matter protests has come from police and from white supremacists such as Kyle Rittenhouse, the Proud Boys, and militia groups who believe they are fulfilling the president's wishes. And so it would seem from those examples like presidents are simply unpersuaded by protest. Even these Black Lives Matter protests that I would argue have garnered more mainstream support than any other protest I've witnessed in the nearly 20 years that I've been doing this work. But if presidents or elected officials are seemingly unmoved by protests, then why do activists continue to do it? What's the point? Well, the first thing that we need to do if we want to understand how protest and social movements in general actually affect change in the world is we have to rid ourselves of the notion that the purpose of a protest is simply to persuade. Now, sometimes, of course, protest works to raise awareness and persuade certain members of the public. That makes sense, right? And sometimes protest works to persuade members of a movement to keep struggling and stay involved. But rarely are protests engaged to persuade those in power, like presidents, to share or give up their power. Instead, protests often have different goals and different effects. They move beyond simple persuasion. Protests and social movements in a larger sense instead work to create new ways of being in the world. And they work to expand the world of thinkable thoughts. So think about the abolition of slavery, the 40-hour work week, women voting, Black people voting, marriage between LGBTQ people. To even consider most of these ideas was for some to go against their country and its laws, their community, their families, and even their religion. These were quite simply unthinkable thoughts before social movements brought them into reality. And more recently, things like defunding the police, abolishing ICE, abolishing prisons. These have become topics of conversation all over the country and an actual reality in some precincts. These are things that most people outside of sort of particular social movement circles would have never considered a thinkable thought, much less an actionable policy just a few short months ago. Now, these are top agenda items on many local governments' agendas and are questions that are being posed to our presidential candidates by voters. Simply unthinkable I would say even a year ago. And so social movements and the protests that they engage can have policy effects, right? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Obergefell versus Hodges, which enshrined marriage rights. All of those examples, right, are policy examples. But for someone who does the kind of work I do, social movements also have a rhetorical or cultural effect that's often hard to measure, even though we do know that these effects occur. These kinds of changes can be seen in how our language, our everyday practices, our imagery, and our culture changes over time. And sometimes it's a long time. Think about how we now do and do not talk about disability, how it's no longer acceptable to use the N-word, how we have positive and humanized representations of trans people and other minoritized people in popular culture, how terms like the 99%, the 1%, Black Lives Matter, or defund the police have become commonly used and even unavoidable topics of conversation in the public sphere. And what rhetorical scholars like myself want us to understand is that this is not a small thing. When we change the way we talk about something, when we add new language into our social realities, we actually change the way we think about those things. And that is social movement. It's the movement of public consciousness, of how we understand the world and our place in it, how the social is moved forward. And that movement doesn't come from nowhere. It's not inevitable. It happens through the work of social movements and the protest rhetoric that they create. Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who's an educator, writer, and a prominent Black Lives Matter activist, once stated that, quote, "Protest is not meant to gain the support of the privileged. It intentionally reveals the discomfort of the dispossessed to the privileged to encourage change." And if we understand protest this way, as something that encourages change by moving the social, and not just as something that is supposed to persuade privileged power holders like presidents or other people, then we can start to understand social movements' relationship to change as so much more than how it just affects electoral politics. Grace Lee Boggs, an activist from Detroit and a philosopher, argued that, quote, "Positive changes, leaps forward in the evolution of humankind, do not start with governments," right? Those changes don't start with governments, right? She even said upon the election of President Obama, a massive historical moment, right? She said even then, we can't wait around for him. We can't wait around for presidents or leaders to swoop in and fix all of our problems. She said, we are the leaders that we are looking for. And she's right. Sidney Tarrow once said that we are in a permanent movement society where individual movements might wax and wane over time, become very important, sort of lose importance. But he argues that it's the contentious politics that those social movements and protests create that are actually the way that politics works. That's the way things get done. And I really started to believe that was true around the election of President Obama. I worked with a lot of activists in the anti-war movement and human rights movement at that time, and they didn't seem really excited about campaigning for President Obama or getting really excited about it. Well, then presidential candidate Obama. And I was very excited. I thought, this is so exciting. This is so important. And they said, yeah, this is great. And we're absolutely going to vote for him and it's going to be great. But they just didn't seem excited. And I didn't understand why. And what they said is, we've seen presidents come and go, right? And we understand that the change that actually happens in our communities comes from the people in those communities. Presidents are important, but it's the work that gets done is done by us. And so we vote and we, like it when we have a good president, but we're still going to be doing the work because that's what happens. And so that's really important to understand that social movements and those communities engaging in protest and other actions and tactics, right, are the things that are creating social change. Those are the things that are affecting that cultural level. And so it's up to us, right? It is up to us to create those contentious political spaces, those contentious politics that Sidney Terra talks about. It's up to us to move the social, right? And not only by voting in better presidents, though that is very important and of course matters, right? So the question isn't really how can social movements affect presidents, but how can we affect social change? How can we move the social beyond the confines of electoral politics? How can we become the leaders that we are looking for? And I really hope that you'll think about that after you vote on Tuesday. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn things over now to our final panelist, Dr. Tim Horner.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm kind of slightly distracted. I've been so absorbed in these last two speakers. Thank you to Dr. Gadson and also to Dr. Murray for all of this interesting stuff. My role here today is to talk about this election within the two contexts, within the context of COVID-19, a pandemic, and also within the context of foreign policy. Now, this is not to say that I only do foreign policy, that I only think about that. I do the weekly Global Smackdown, and I teach courses on genocide, and I teach things on global aspects. But I in no way want to pit what I'm going to say here sort of in an either or scenario. So what I want to do is I want to acknowledge the circles here. I want to acknowledge the concentric circles that we have on display here, that that there are expanding circles of concern that we all have. And the fact that I am able to stand in this place and talk about foreign policy or talk about the impact of COVID on America's relationship to other countries in the world and our relationship as a global community is a sign of the privilege that I carry with me because of my status, because of my whiteness and my maleness and all of those things which have protected me from the influence, from the more dire influences of this current pandemic. And so I want to acknowledge, especially what Dr. Gadson is saying about the importance of healthcare, especially as it relates to those communities that are far more exposed to the dangers of COVID than I am. And not to pit what I say sort of against those circles of concern. And the same could be said with the way that our country is thinking about race relations and how we want to see each other and who is American and how we treat those people that we count to be American and those hierarchies that we're all trying to deconstruct and reevaluate. So, but I do want to also talk about foreign policy in a context of COVID, because COVID is something that is influencing not only just America, although we have been hit the worst of all other developed countries because of the way that we have handled this, but also foreign policy is also, I really liked what Dr. Murray was saying about how in some ways social movements, it doesn't matter which president you have because social movements rise up from the people and that's the way they should be. But when it comes to foreign policy, our leaders are really important. This is one of the things that the executive branch has control of that the Congress does not, and nor does the judiciary, is how we relate to other countries. And so making of treaties, foreign policy, our relationship to the UN, with the State Department, all of these things which are outreach, including the military, that outreach into the larger globe, our global community, that is really under the leadership of our leaders. So in some sense, who we have as a leader, especially as president, is very, very important when it comes to foreign policy. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about how these two candidates might influence our foreign policy, but also I need to say something about COVID, because COVID is the thing that is probably shifting the world more than any single American president could ever reshift the world. The world is reshuffling it right now. And it's not that COVID is qualitatively different than other things that might happen in the world, but there's a way in which COVID has exposed the cracks that were already in the system when it comes to how we relate as countries within each other or as a global community. And the writing has been on the wall for this since the end of World War II. And it certainly has been on the writing on the wall since the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union, where you have a sole superpower, the United States of America, and feeling as though it is the only superpower because it is the only superpower. That status of superpower has been eroding for several years, but two things have accelerated that erosion. The first thing was the election of President Trump, who is an unabashed America First president who has a very different style of interacting with other countries than previous presidents before him. But the bigger thing is COVID. And so COVID has exposed and sort of accelerated the things that were already in motion. So now we find ourselves in an election where we have these two massive, an election in a week. And also we're in the midst of a global pandemic, which is by no means over, not over in this country, but also not over on the globe. So when we're talking about foreign policy and COVID and leaders, it feels as though we are on the outer rim of these concentric circles of concern. And yet we do have these concerns. Part of the American ethos is this idea, and it's a problematic one, but the idea that somehow America has a role in the world, and that role is somehow connected to bringing good into the world, or making life better for other people on the planet, or standing up for human rights as we define them. I realize these are all problematic ideas because if you scratch under the surface, you're going to find hypocrisies and you're going to find all sorts of problematic attempts to save the world. But I'm more interested in the idea that we have a role, or this ethos that America has a role in the world. I don't think we know exactly what that is yet, but that feeling is something that is particularly American. It is a product of colonialism. Yes, it is a very problematic idea, but it's still something that I think we can build on. The reason I know this is because I teach classes on genocide and I teach stuff on global stuff. And there is concern out there that the world needs help. There are vulnerable populations in the world. There are vulnerable populations in this country, within American soil, on American soil, but there's also vulnerable populations. But to show you how difficult this is to sort of get at and how this is related to the leaders, I just want to talk about the situation in Yemen just a few minutes. Because in Yemen, this has been something that has been going on for years, but just recently there's been more news, and I just heard something on the BBC this morning which talks about, I think it's like well over 2 million children are, quote, on the brink of starvation in Yemen. This is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. It has been since it usurped Syria maybe 2 years ago as the largest humanitarian crisis. And yet it sits there and there's nothing happening in Yemen. The biggest problem we have for America, when America looks at Yemen, the biggest problem we have is how to get Americans out of Yemen fast, as quickly as possible. And the way that the US, the only policy stuff you can find about Yemen is whether or not the US will allow Yemenis Americans living in Yemen to get out of the country and come to America. And there are a lot of Yemenis Americans who are facing huge barriers just getting back to America. But the humanitarian idea has been left really stagnant and lacking a great deal of money. And so you say, well, that's connected to the UN, right? Like this is the place that we would get aid for a country like this. And that's true, but the UN has been strapped. The UN is at almost the bottom of their purse when it comes to trying to address these problems. This is far bigger than the UN is connected. And the UN is funded and connected by countries around that pool money into this to try to solve some of these immediate problems. On the surface, there's an immediate problem of starvation and humanitarian aid in Yemen. There's also COVID in the country as well. But then there's also the politics behind it. And the politics behind it, even though it feels really distant, is related to us. Because the conflict in Yemen, the reason we have this in Yemen is because of the proxy wars going on inside of Yemen between Saudi Arabia, who is on the side of the Houthi government, and the Houthi rebels, which is probably funded by Iran. And so these two global powers, Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, are fighting a proxy war in Yemen against one another through these proxy wars. And no one seems to be doing anything about it. Why doesn't the US step in? Well, because the US has been on the side of Saudi Arabia for generations. And this president in particular is totally committed to Saudi Arabia. Now, granted, Saudi Arabia's reputation in the world is waning a little bit, but recently they've had a rejuvenation of this. The UAE and Bahrain, which are great Saudi allies, and now recently, Sudan just joined into normalizing relationships with Israel. So now Israel and Saudi Arabia are joining that coalition, which is on the side of the US, which is bolstering and supporting this alliance, which means Iran is more isolated. Iran is also growing in this regional power, and Saudi Arabia and Iran are growing to be two huge regional powers there that are starting to reshape the Middle East. Then this is related to Israel, right? Everybody always used to say, if you can solve Israel, you can solve the Middle East problem. That's no longer the case. That is old thinking. That is no longer the case. So and this administration has helped that to sort of throw in such an unambiguous support to Israel that it has emboldened Saudi Arabia and emboldened this idea and also emboldened Iran. So this is where we come back to the way that we do foreign policy is a reflection of who we are as a country. This has some high stakes to it when it comes to the election about these two very different styles. So, I mean, the idea that Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal has also isolated America, that Trump's particular style of dealing with other countries is very much the way he conducted his business. He is not interested in being allies with other partners. He works alone. He's always worked alone as a business person, and he continues to use America, to think of America as his company. And so he is interacting with the world just as he interacted with the other companies when he was CEO or as a television star, as a single entity. This has degraded the relationships that we've had, the allies we've had in the last several generations. And if you look at graphs about the way that the world sees America, our reputation in the world is taking a serious hit. It is dipping, especially when it comes to European and our other allies. And he likes to interact with other countries on a one-on-one basis. So countries like China, I know he speaks a lot about them, but he wants to have a one-on-one relationship with them. Russia as well. He has a very ambiguous relationship with Russia. And NATO is something that he doesn't really want to get involved in because he's just one of many. This president does not like to be one of many. He wants to be the only one at a time. That has its own, in some sense, there are some people that see this as an advantage because he wants to remove like the military from the sort of an interaction with the world. And for hawks, they don't like that. They want the US military to be omnipresent throughout the globe. And so his pulling troops back is appealing to some. It feels dangerous to others. And so, but it has accelerated this idea, and COVID has even made it more of an acceleration that we are turtling in. This is a global phenomenon that we are facing right now, that countries in response to the pandemic are turning away from their interactions with other groups. Immigration numbers are shut down. European is shutting down immigration numbers from Syria and other countries into there. And the excuse used is COVID. Now, some of it is legitimate, but some of it is just giving an occasion to do the thing that they probably wanted to do before, but couldn't afford to do it because it was so unpopular. Now that's even grown worse. Again, it's exacerbating the problem. So when we come to like thinking about a new administration in this era of COVID, it's easy to get very unicorns and rainbows about a new administration, as though somehow we're going to return to America's greatness if we get rid of this administration. That is not true. That is a dangerous utopian idea. The past, the America that was interacting with the world in the 1990s is not what we want to return to. I think President Clinton, actually a Democrat, said it best in response to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. He said, America's interaction with the world has to be measured against American interests and our own interests in the game, which is another way of saying, and this is our foreign policy, and it has been for decades. If it doesn't affect us directly, we have no interest in being there. So for any of us that think that somehow if we get a new president or this president, that somehow we're going to return to that sort of America as a savior of the world, who's going to ride in and stop all these bad guys from doing bad things to their people and then sort of be this advocate for human rights, that's a very naive kind of view of what's going to happen here. Because the fact of the matter is that the world is reshifting. And the powers of the world are reshifting. And America is no longer going to be the sole superpower in the world. Economically, this is going to take a little longer because the dollar is still the sort of the universal currency. And we can still wield a lot of strength by putting sanctions on people or offering them special deals with the American dollar that other countries can't do. But in many ways, the writing has been on the wall for a long time. And COVID has just accelerated this. So we as Americans need to think about, who do we want to be in the world without claiming ourselves to be the sole superpower? And that's an idea that doesn't come easy to any Americans. I don't care whether you're a Democrat, or Republican, or independent, that idea does not come easy to us. But this is the direction that it is going. It's not going to happen probably in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of our students here, they need to start thinking about different concepts of what and who we are, not only as a country within ourselves, but who we are in the world, and what our role is, not only with ourselves and fellow Americans, but also who we are in the world and how we're going to use the power that we have. I'm not saying that we are going to be reduced to a developing country or we're going to lose all of our power, but there is a reshuffling going on, and COVID is accelerating this and really bringing this on in an extremely fast measure. I thought it was interesting too on that first one that the first two graphs that Dr. Gadson looked, if you look carefully, I was looking at foreign policy and where it dropped, and like all the numbers on her graph dropped, like all the interest in the 2016, like all the numbers were lower on the 2020 graph by like 10 points or something. And the reason why that is I think there were two categories that came up in 2020 that were not there in 2016. And those two categories were race and racial equality. Had 50 points that wasn't even on the 2016 concern. And the other one was COVID, which took up 60 interest points away from those other numbers. Again, that's something that wasn't there in 2016 and is there in 2020. And those two ideas that we've been talking about today, those are massive issues. They're not directly related, but COVID has occasioned a new level of participation in the American public, a new kind of awareness in that I think might be a really positive thing because it's accelerating things so much. And the other ways that are accelerating things that are really, really bad and really destructive and degrades the human experience of so many people on this planet. But there are other ways in which it might be seen as an advantage that actually is empowering a whole new generation of people to see the direct link between, as Dr. Murray was talking about, the direct link between protest and policy change or cultural change, not only within our country, not only on domestic issues, but foreign issues. I've been up a long time, this is my closing comment, that the line between domestic issues and foreign policy is becoming diluted. We used to think of these as two separate things, but we are in an interconnected world now. And the fact that COVID is a pandemic that affects us all is showing us how interconnected we are, right? It is the one thing that it's way more than the internet. I think we feel connected to other people in the world in ways that we have never felt before because we are suffering with the same pandemic. Now, that's a terrible occasion for having that sense of connectedness, but I do think there is a way in which that is going to have a tangible effect in how we negotiate this new space that is opened up from us because of the chaos caused by COVID. I just don't know what that's going to look like. So on that very ambiguous note, I think I will open it up for questions and answer. I will send it back over to Meryl Stein, and he can take control of the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dr. Gadson, Dr. Murray, and Dr. Horner for those insights. At this time, if anyone would like to enter questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, that would be very helpful. We have till about 1 o'clock. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but for sake of time, we may have to be more selective. So let's see how it goes. We'll look at the first question. Let's see here. Okay. We are awaiting some questions from participants, and let's see how that's going.
Well, you know how I fill up this space, right? We have the panelists talk amongst themselves.
There, certainly, we could always do that. If anyone wants to address any other comments that came up, this is a good chance for the panelists to do that at this point, and we'll see if we have any other questions in between. So if there's anything that you feel that you neglected to say at this point or you want to emphasize, it's a good time. We also have one question. If the presidents aren't the cause of social movements, are the issues the social movements deal with determined by the president and his administration? And I think I'll direct this to Dr. Murray first.
Sure. I think there's a yes and a no there, right? And so I don't think presidents cause social movements. I think social movements come up based on the lived experiences of people, right? People that are experiencing injustice or people that are experiencing a lack of the very basic things they need: food, healthcare, like Dr. Gadson talked about. They see problems in the world, like what Dr. Horner's talking about, and it's those people who sort of bring those things into existence. Now, the sort of flip of that is that sometimes presidents and administrations do things that perpetuate or create injustice, right? Like laws that say LGBTQ people can't get married, or that police should receive astronomical amounts of funding over other social services, right? Those things are often created by politicians, right? Presidents, administrations. And so it may be that when those policies are created, it creates a situation for people in their lived life, right? That they then sort of do that. So I think this can happen in a lot of different ways, because I think there are injustices that exist in the world that don't necessarily come from presidents and administrators. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Dr. Gadson, I'm going to ask you next, what values do you think are moving voters most this election?
Yeah, that's really a great question. And what's coming to mind first might be a little bit well, it's not cynical, but I think this issue of interconnectedness, right? That we're all more connected to one another, as Dr. Horner talked about, in my opinion, is causing folks to want to make sure that they are maintaining their boundaries and individual freedoms, right? And so the values that people are holding are that I want to be sure that I can move how I need to move, make the decisions that I need to make, care for my family and my communities in the ways that I need to. So it's this very interesting interplay between being connected but certainly not wanting to be lumped, right? And individuals are needing to think about how my actions are impacting other people, right? And the resistance that we're starting to see from that, even when it's something as simple as mask wearing, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up, because I may not have put enough emphasis on that. I in no way think that this is a kumbaya moment of coming together, because actually what is happening now is people feel more invaded now than they ever have felt before. And I think this is what happens too when you have a world that is shrinking down on us and we do feel interconnected. That doesn't necessarily mean that we feel good about it. That means we can feel invaded. And you see an entire class of people in this country, mostly privileged people, who are feeling invaded. They're being told they're invaded, and so they feel invaded, even if they're not being invaded. And that invasion is causing them to turtle into smaller and smaller subgroups, whether it's on Facebook or whether it's on 4chan. You know, like this is creating an opposite effect. This is why this is a crux of something that is happening. And I think our initial reaction is now to turtle in, get our subgroups together, and circle the wagons. I think the long-term effects are going to be different than that. But I really appreciate your point bringing this up. And I feel cynical when I say that, but I also know what I see, and I'm seeing what you see too. And so that's a kind of a symptom, or it's our reaction to this fast collapse of the world that
I
we see
agree.
around us.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Horner to begin to answer this question, and others may want to step in. Next question asks, what is your reaction to Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmation, and what do you think will be her direct impact on America's political future? So,
I like to take the long view on these things. I like to think that for every reaction for every action there is a reaction, and I try to see things along. What I think about is Prop 8 a lot. Prop 8 was this proposition that came out in California, which made same-sex marriage illegal in California, and it was thought to be this great victory for the conservatives, right, or for people that didn't want this. And they thought, yes, we did it, we got Prop 8, and they had all that. What it did is it had an opposite effect. It led to the legalization of same-sex marriage throughout the entire country, right? So just at the moment when some groups think that they're at the apex of their victory, that means usually historically they are at the apex of their decline. And so acts of power like this, which is a raw act of power grabbing, any Trump supporter would say, oh, hell yes, it's a raw power grab. I mean, they would think that was a good thing. I'm not judging it, I'm saying what it is. There's going to be a reaction against this. And I think I think Roe v. Wade is going to, if they overturn Roe v. Wade, wow, watch out. Because this is going to have a reaction that pro-life advocates are going to wish they never touched Roe. So, I mean, I think short term, it's scary, it feels scary, it feels like it's out of whack, but only out of whack if you're on a certain team. Long term, culturally, we are moving in a very particular direction. It's a slower moving train, but it is moving, and one appointment to the Supreme Court is not going to upset that. That's my view, but I'd be interested to hear what our other panelists think.
anyone else would like to comment?
I mean,
Okay.
Dr. Horner has made me hopeful because I feel it makes me very sad. Sadness, the lack of concern, the lack of cooperation, the lack of consistency, the different rules for different people, different circumstances. Like it feels very like this sense of fairness is out of whack. So I'm gonna hold on to what Dr. Horner suggests and look at the long game. And I hope what you say it comes to fruition.
I think the only thing I would add to that is her confirmation is just one in a long, they've packed the federal courts and the concern over Roe and the Affordable Care Act is so important that this is going to affect so many other things as well, particularly First Amendment sorts of issues, which is what I am most concerned about. But one thing that I think makes me hopeful in all of that is that I would really like for people to take these last 4 years and all of these sorts of issues with the courts, with the executive branch, with our legislative branch, to see our system is kind of broken, right? That the checks and balances that are in place between the courts and the legislature and the executive branch do not function anymore. They are not working. And that hopefully that will lead to some sort of change, like term limits for Supreme Court justices, or the thought that why are we leaving the fate of so many massively important things in the hands of 9 people who were not elected? And so let's sort of think about that. The entirety of our world rested in the hands of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How is that okay as a system? It's not. And so it's one of those things that I'm hopeful that all of these holes will become apparent to people and that they'll see we need to make some changes in the way our government functions, because clearly there are some broken pieces here.
Yeah. And can I say a word about hope too? That hope classically has made people complacent, and fear is much more of a galvanizer of human action. That if you scare people, they're more likely to react and do something, but they don't always do the best thing. In fact, they almost always do the worst thing possible when they're scared. But hope can be a tremendously galvanizing factor as well. When I say hope, and when I think what Dr. Gadson and Dr. Murray say hope, we're not talking about, I hope somebody takes care of this. We're saying we have hope. We see signs that there is a possibility to move things, but that has to come from people. That doesn't come from, that's what Dr. Murray's talking about. Like if this generation, I know there are a lot of students on this, watching this because it's an ACS approved event, but honestly, if you have learned nothing so far in your short lives, you need to learn that this power is in your hands. There's not somebody who's going to just take care of it because they know what they're doing. The curtain has been pulled back. COVID has pulled the curtain back. And now we are seeing what happens when people don't know what they're doing. It costs American lives. It costs human lives. And but that can change. Just like it can change with people interacting with it before, that is still in place. So when we say hope, we're not saying, I hope somebody fixed this. We're saying, I have hope that it will be fixed, but only in our own hands.
Thank you. So related to some of these most recent comments, we have a question about why do you think the United States can't produce better politicians? In the 2016 election and for many voters in 2020, people feel they are choosing between the lesser of two evils. So maybe I'll ask Dr. Murray to begin comment on that also.
Sure. So I think the one reason we can't produce better, I think there's a lot of reasons, and I'll leave some of that to the political scientists in the room. But the part of it is who wants that job, right? Like who really wants that job, especially in our current climate? And what is motivating them to want that job? Like, are they really motivated by civil service and wanting to make the world better? I'd like to think that they are, but is that really what we've seen historically or more recently? I think some of the other issues to think about in terms of the lesser of two evils, and this is what I interact with a lot of people who don't vote, right? Who say, and this is a huge question every election year, they say that system is broken and I'm not going to participate in it, right? And I deal with a lot of people who are anarchists and anti-fascists, and that's what they believe. I am not saying that is the right thing. I'm saying this is a way of thinking about that. And so I think the way to sort of think about that lesser of two evils thing is thinking about, what do we have the power to do, right? As people, we have the power to vote, and that's important, and we should do that. That is one little piece, right? Which is what I was sort of trying to get at in all of this. And if that means we're going to do the lesser of two evils, because picking the lesser of the two evils affects a lot of people in terms of their healthcare, in terms of racism, funding, military war, all of it, right? So you do that thing. But then what are all of the other things that you can do? So instead of sort of feeling defeated, like, well, I can't really get a good president, I guess I'll vote for this person. What is it that you can do after Tuesday, right? If you're really concerned about making the world better, there are a lot more things that you can do outside of electoral politics. And that's really what I try to instill, like in my own work, is that that's the work that's so fulfilling and that makes you feel like you're doing your part. And I think that's something we have to sort of remember, that these elections aren't, they're super important, but they're not the only thing.
Thank you. Anyone else on that?
Gadson, you want to get in here?
Sure. I'll just a quick note. So we've already talked about the fact that the system is broken as well. And so, for the past few election cycles, we've been focusing on, both sides have been focusing on nominees that can beat someone else, right? Who can beat, who can, get these votes, who can. And while it seems like the policy is kind of after the fact, right? Figuring out what good policy is, how we can implement the best changes that we need to meet people's needs, to care for our communities. It's about what's most strategic, right? And so it becomes like war, right? And it's just how can we win this war? How can we win this state? How can we win this debate, right? And it's less comprehensive in terms of what are we going to do after, right? To Dr. Murray's point, right? What are we going to do after the fact to bring the country back together, right? Regardless of who wins, and are we going to actually be able to get work done, right, as well, right, with so much tension going back and forth?
I think that analogy is so important because I think this gets exactly what we're talking about. Voting on Tuesday, or hopefully earlier than that, that's a battle, right? And we're in a war. And so what are all the other battle, fronts that because we cannot just think tactically, right? Tactics are voting, tactics are protesting, right? How do we connect those tactics to larger strategies? What is the strategy that can beat out the strategies like that are so corrupt and unjust and all of that? And so we have to really think at that strategic level, even though that's really hard and takes a lot more work. But I think that analogy is so perfect for that,
Yeah.
for thinking about that.
And if I can come back to the original question, in the question, there seems to be embedded a certain mentality that I want to talk about, because the question is phrased like, why can't we do this? In that question seems to be embedded the assumption that we have never done it before and we can't do it and we're not good at it. There's a certain, and this is where history comes in, because we are the product of a particular point in history. First of all, I should say that Americans are notoriously shallow when their historical memory, right? That's part of who we are. We only live in the most shallow of pools, and we move in that. In some ways, that's an advantage because we never remember the bad things that happen. We only live in the moment. But in this case, it's fairly dangerous that the depth of that we don't understand this is because there has been a concerted effort in this country for the last 50 years to make sure that Americans believe that government is bad, and that the more government you had, the worse it is. This goes back to Reagan. This goes back to this idea that more government is bad government, that my job as president is to reduce the size of government because government is bad. This is an entire generation, and college students, this is your parents, maybe even your grandparents that think that. So that question is a product of a very deliberate, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but the evidence is overwhelming how deliberate this idea is to get people to think that government will hurt you and that the only thing that will save you is corporate America. And that the economy and corporatization of America is the savior of the American dream. And so government is inefficient, it's bloated, it's corrupt, it doesn't do anything good, it's special interest, it's all of these things. That is not the way that it always was, nor is it the way that it always needs to be. That our future is unwritten. We decide what we want our to be. And if we frame the question in why can't we do this, that's a frustrated question. And I understand the frustration of that question. Because we have been tuned to only see bad things come out of government, we don't have a good vision. And by we, I mean my generation. I actually think this is changing. I see signs of young, vibrant leaders who are getting involved in politics, who are really seeing that the investment in politics can be something that can grow. It can even grow out of protest, Dr. Murray. It can come out of these movements where people see, hey, politics is something where you can actually change things, structural changes that can affect the lives of millions of people, not just your local community. And we need people like that. There's no doubt we need people like that. But then we also need people who know how to get into the weeds, to create policy, to know how to get into the devil in the details, and to undo these things that are woven into our tax system, woven into our judicial system, woven into our criminal justice system, that have been there so long it feels like they're permanent. They're not. It's up to us to go in there and find those things and pull them out and ask ourselves, do we want to keep this? And that's hopeful, that I think, but that is slow change. But I understand the ethos behind that question, but it's a frustrated question.
Thank you. One more question. Since there was such a shift in the issues of importance from 2016 to 2020, do any of you see more shifts in issues in the coming years? And I'll start with Dr. Gadson.
Yeah, another great question. And I'll again return to this idea of hope and comment further on Dr. Horner had pointed out that race and ethnicity, race inequality had shown up on the list from 2020. And my hope is that that category, that issue, right, stays on the list. This is not, dealing with issues of structural racism, systemic racism is not something that is going to be fixed overnight. It's not something that's going to be fixed in one administration. At the same time, I hope we don't continue to just kind of see it as an issue that just stays out there. But I hope it represents that we are now, as a country, as a nation, regardless of where you stand on any of these issues, we can no longer say we don't know, right? We can no longer say we haven't seen it. We can no longer say, I've just never been exposed and color blindness and all of these things, right? We can all see the news. We can all read the newspapers. We all see social media. We all see what's happening, right? And so then younger generations, right? And oh, well, all of us, right? All of the generations will be able to have more informed discussions, right, and understandings, informed opinions about issues around racial inequality. We can't just ignore it any longer. So I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to see that issue raised in a concern for future voters.
Thank you. Dr. Horner, we have a question that says, if the U.S. is losing its prominent world power status, what countries have moved into that position, and what are the repercussions of this shift?
Yeah, I think that for me, it's not I don't think there's going to be a global superpower again. I think that that's over now. We're too big of we're too big of a globe. We're too interconnected. We're too intertwined. We know too much about what's going on in everybody's backyard. There's no way we're going to be able to pull off that thing, and there's not going to be another emergent superpower. Just like I don't think there's ever going to be a World War III in a conventional way where we talk about a world war. The world is too different. And I think that's hard for people to really get their heads around, that the world is really going to be a different place. Like, this planet's going to be different. Climate change has started that. COVID is starting that, and the internet has blown it out of the park, right? Just like what Dr. Gadson is saying, we can't unsee the things we've seen. So I don't think there's going to be a single superpower. There will be regional powers. I think this was the Trump model. Let China do China in the Asia. Let Russia do Russia with Europe. Take away, and let America just be America. Like, that's a very old thinking, actually. That's a 19th century model. Like, America, we're off here, we're off on the side. We do our own things. Europe does their own thing, and Asia does their own thing. He's a product of colonialism. But those lines are breaking down. So I don't see Russia ascending much. Their economy is not strong. I see China ascendant. China globally, both their presence in the world, economically, they're on the way up. My long-term one, and I want to always make a plug for this, is sub-Saharan Africa, which is one of the things if you wanted me to see who's going to be in this place in 100 years, who's going to be the global power that has the most creativity, the most hope, the most innovation, sub-Saharan Africa for my money. That's the one to watch, because there are some exciting things happening on that continent in particular. But it's going to be a long time down the line. But you can see it shifting in that direction.
Thank you. One more question I'm going to ask Dr. Murray, and we're about 5 minutes out for time, so this may be our last question. Is President Trump creating a more extremist right, or is he just exposing beliefs the right has always had but shied away from saying, since, for example, for 8 years there was an African-American president in office?
So obviously, when I'm not just studying protests, right, I study hate groups, extremist groups. And what's interesting about framing that in terms of the Obama administration is that the actual largest increase in hate group activity that we have ever seen in this country since they started tracking those kinds of things was in the month after Obama was elected. Hate group activity just spiked through the roof. So I think absolutely racism and anti-Semitism and all of those things have always existed, and they have always been virulent and damaging and extreme. I do think that President Trump emboldened a lot of those groups. So when I started studying hate groups in 2014, and I say this all the time, I feel like in my presentations, people thought I was crazy. They're like, why would you study these crazy extremists? Like, aren't there only like 10 Klan members in the whole country? Who even cares? Nobody pays attention to that. And I was like, I don't know, guys, this is messed up stuff. And then in 2016, I got to say, hey, told you so. I really didn't want to have to. But it's because they became so emboldened. We saw Charlottesville, right? We saw all of these things happen because all of a sudden it was okay to just tell it like it is. It was okay to just say what you thought, no matter how racist or homophobic or anti-Semitic or misogynist, right? And so I do think a presidential candidate and a president's rhetoric has a lot of weight, right? It works in ways that when I say something, it doesn't matter, right? Because I'm just, you know, a person who doesn't have a lot of power. When the president says something, there's a lot more power. And so I think those groups absolutely 100% have been emboldened, not just in that campaign, but throughout the past 4 years. Just a few weeks ago with the whole sort of stand up and stand back and stand up or whatever to the Proud Boys, right? Those things, they listen to those things, they believe those things. And so they believe they are doing what the president is telling them to do. And so I absolutely think that that's super important to pay attention to, even when we get a better president, you know, keep paying attention because those things are still going to matter. Those groups are still going to be there. Those sentiments are still going to be there. I don't know that they're going to go back undercover, but they might, but that doesn't mean they're gone. We have to be constantly vigilant, and that's unfortunate, but it's simply the way that it works. So that would be sort of my probably very long answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few more minutes and we have one more question. So I'll finish with that and any comments anybody wants to provide. How can you have an informed opinion when we're seeing the internet take over the information system? And if I may relate that to journalism, and does there need to be a new journalism or is something else happening that needs to be trained? Thank you.
I'll go.
So,
I'm a communication person. I'll say, so here's my thing. And I can't remember which one of the other panelists spoke to this, but it might have been Dr. Horner. What we have seen, it's not just about the internet. It is a degradation of our education system that says when I am inundated with information, false information, misinformation, alternative facts, all of the things we've seen that are because of the internet, right? Because now all of a sudden that's everywhere and it's so much easier to promulgate those ideas. That at the end of the day is not the core of our problem. There's always been bad journalism, bad information, lying politicians, right? Or whatever. The problem becomes we have been undereducated for so long. We no longer know how to deal with that. We don't know how to critically think about that information. We don't know how to tell the difference between good information and bad information. We have undereducated young people, particularly in minoritized communities, for so long that they simply cannot think about that information in ways that is more critical. So to me, the problem is not so much the internet. The problem is we can't make those informed decisions because we don't know how to parse through the information that we're getting. We have to be more strategic thinkers, and we're not teaching young people in particular how to be strategic thinkers. These attacks on things like critical race theory and academics, that's all part of that. And we have to really push back against that so that we can make those informed opinions, not simply because of information, but because of how we sort of process and understand and make decisions related to that information.
Okay. We are out of time. So I know we could go on, but we're out of time. We've gotten through many questions. And I want to thank all the panelists for sharing so many perspectives with us today and providing some rays of hope along the way. It's been very helpful. So Dr. Gadson, Dr. Murray, Dr. Horner, thank you so very much for spending time with us. We appreciate it. And again, interested voters can visit Let's Vote Nova's webpage for information about voting and the upcoming election. Thank you everyone for joining us for our virtual election series today. Have a good afternoon and stay well.
Thanks
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.